Hello and welcome to a Very Okay podcast. My name is Trey Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Historical Society. And with me, as always, is Dr. Bob Blackburn. Bob, it's great to see you again today.
Thank you, Trey. It's always good to be here with you, especially in the spring when the weather is so beautiful and it's good to be outside and seeing everyone having a good time and being healthy.
Yeah, it's great. We've had a good run of weather with some sunshine lately. I was at Fort Gibson last weekend, and we had our Fort Gibson Education Days where we had a lot of folks out there that were portraying living history, everything from the fur trade and the Sanitation Commission to black soldiers during the Civil War. We had David Reed, one of our staffers, was showing kids how the infantry worked during the 1820s and 1830s. But it's a beautiful day out there, but the ground was very soggy because of all the rain that we have gotten. And I walked down to the Neosho River, which was right at that point where Colonel Arbuckle brought his 7th Infantry soldiers in 1824 and decided to make Fort Gibson where the first fort in Indian Territory. And the river was up quite a bit. You couldn't even see that rock shelf where they landed on over 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, I'm sorry. And the river was up quite some ways. And it's been good. The legislature is wrapping up its session right now. And, most agencies are getting flat budgets, and as are we. And we actually asked for a flat budget this year because I read the writing on the wall and knew that we probably wouldn't get that much of an increase. But I am glad it looks like we're going to get a $2.8 million one-time appropriation for a new HVAC system in this building. And that will be new chillers, new boiler, new humidity controls, a new cooling tower. As you're well aware, because I know you've been working on the article about it, but this building is 20 years old, and with that, it's time for a new climate control system in this building. And of course, you also know that we have to keep this building in the right temperature and the right humidity because we have thousands and thousands of artifacts that we have to preserve for the long term, and you have to keep those systems in the right order.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned Fort Gibson, and one of the pleasures that I had is that when I was in graduate school at OSU, I was a consultant on historic preservation, did a research topic on where was the original fort. And we knew that it was not on the original site when the WPA built the modern stockade because the railroad went through part of the old, but no one knew for sure. So we studied maps and we did it, and I did all these overlays. Well, fast forward 25 years later, Oklahoma Archaeological Society, and OU took it on to try to find the foundations of the fort, and they found them. And they go right underneath the railroad tracks there.
Right.
But it was like Roman soldiers built it. It was a perfect line. I'm an old carpenter, so I got down on my hands and knees and eyeballed that thing, and it was just as straight as could be. So those soldiers knew what they were doing when they were building forts and stockades and other improvements across. And the engineers knew exactly what they were doing. Now, of course, we had to cover it up to protect it after we finished, but I'll never forget seeing that trench and those sandstone foundations for the old stockade that were there in 1824.
Most people don't know, but if you were an infantry soldier in Indian Territory in the 1820s, most likely you probably never fired your gun in anger or in battle, but most likely what you did all of the time is build roads.
Yeah. And if you were dead, you probably died from disease.
That's right.
Rather than from a gunshot or an arrow.
They didn't call it the Charnel House of the Prairie for nothing.
That's right.
Well, I'm excited about our topic today, Bob, and I want to go ahead and bring our guest into here. One of the things that I love covering is our Native American history in Oklahoma because, we are Oklahoma because of the tribes that either were here at first or were moved here through the Indian removal process. And the chance to learn more about those tribes, I always embrace that opportunity. And this is Jake Tiger. He is an enrolled member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. He also has lineage of the Sac and Fox Nation and the Red Lake Ojibwe Nation. He is from the Bear Clan and from the Thomas Palmer Band of the Seminole Nation and the current band chief of the Thomas Palmer Band. He's been employed with the Seminole Nation Historic Preservation Office for over 5 years now, and he serves on the board of directors of the Seminole Nation Museum in Wewoka, and my good friend Richard Elwinger runs that museum and does a great job with that. His passion is in living history in the 18th and 19th centuries of the Seminole people and showcasing material culture in various museums in Oklahoma and out of state. Jake Tiger, welcome to the podcast. It is a great pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Trey. I appreciate you guys for having me on. It's a great honor. I've been listening to your podcast since episode 1 when first start recording, so I'm really excited for this.
A longtime fan we have, Bob.
Well, at least we have one.
That's right. We know there's more than one. There's at least 4 or 5 out there for sure. But yes, Jake, I've had the opportunity to get to know you over the past few years because you do great living history presentations and demonstrations and have participated in quite a few OHS events over the time that I've been here as well. And always have great conversations with you. And I loved your passion for preserving this history, for portraying this history. And so, when you and I were talking, you told me you like the podcast. So I was like, well, we have to get Jake on the podcast because I'm sorry to say this doesn't pay a lot, but maybe it gets you some notoriety out here.
Well, it's all for the passion. I'm not here for the money. I just like to talk about history. It's my passion.
Can you talk a little bit about what you usually portray when you do living history?
So that it really varies, especially here and in Oklahoma Indian Territory. I really focus on the removed Seminoles. So, just this past weekend, I was over at Fort Days at Fort Gibson, and I was talking about the history of the Seminoles that were there from the 1830s all the way to the 1850s, telling them, what the removal was like for us and starting new out here. And, talking about, even I was only American Indian out there. So, I didn't want to exclude the Cherokees and the Muskogee Creek. So I'd talk a little bit about their history, just of different writings, especially, like Washington Irving, who came to Indian Territory in 1832 and on his book of the Tour of the Prairies, or if I'm talking about Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock, or if I'm talking about Marcellus Duval and his writings that were done at Fort Gibson. So it really varies. And, back out east, I'll go to places like Fort Toulouse and talk about what life was like in Alabama in the 1750s, or during the time of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, or if I go back to Florida and talk about the Seminole Wars there, and then just the whole broad spectrum of it. So it really kind of varies depending on my environment.
And a lot of when you're doing this, you're dressed in period clothing, much of which you have made yourself, correct?
Yes, everything I make except for my silver work is all done by me. It's all hand sewn. It's all researched on everything I read in trade lists, everything that's been documented through uh, pictures that were done by Charles Bird King or George Catlin or John McStanley, those kind of works. And so it's just a combination of everything I've put together. Different writings. Just even talking about Washington Irving when he talks about some of the Muskogees there. It's really neat to see that because we can see it in writing. But then, I want to see what it looks like in person. So I'll start to reproduce what's written down in black and white and bring it out to, show it to the public. That's probably the most rewarding thing about doing reproductions.
Bob, I know that living history has been important to the OHS for many, many years. And, it's so key, especially for our young people that are getting interested in history, that it's not just about going and getting a lecture or reading something out of the book that they can see and touch and feel.
Our first reenactment was in 1987 at Honey Springs Battlefield. And we recruited some American Indians because they were at the battle. In fact, the majority of the soldiers were American Indian at Honey Springs. And I'll never forget, I was a PhD in history, head of publications at the time, not yet in administration. And the board of directors wanted the reenactment. So the director said, okay, Bob, you're in charge of it. I said, what's a reenactment? Was kind of my first question, but learned. And then we recruited Whit Edwards. And I don't know if you ever worked with Whit Edwards, but he was a genius in terms of living history, created a reputation for Oklahoma. Because at that time, Missouri was really the leading state in the American West, west of the Mississippi, dealing with living history. Texas probably number 2. Well, we earned a reputation as the place to go for authentic reenactments, doing it the right way, keeping the farbs out, the people who thought they were historic. And I do remember recruiting American Indians. I wish you had been around 30, 40 years ago, but you were not even a baby at that time. But there's a difference. A lot of American Indians look at history differently than Western Europeans. Western Europeans are used to saying, starting with Herodotus and ancient Greece, is that kind of detaching yourself from it and looking at history as something that did happen. American Indians look at history as it is happening. And taking yourself out of this continuum is difficult for some American Indians. So I applaud your efforts to get beyond that, to understand the importance of representing a certain time period. But I might say it's probably easier for the Seminoles, and I've worked in Indian country for 40, almost 50 years now. And the Seminoles, I think, have done a better job of maintaining cultural materials, culture of the songs, the dances, the way you come together as a community, the clans. Like if you go to the Cherokees, they don't know what clan they are because that did not survive. Seminoles and Muskogee Creeks as well, I think, are closer to that history than a lot of the other tribes. Kickapoos, same way, I put them in that same category. But I've always admired the Seminole Nation, the Seminole people. Had the opportunity to work for years with Kelly Haney. And Senator Haney was a real supporter of the Historical Society and historic events. And I think served your tribe as tribal chairman at least once, if not more. But yeah, living history, Trey, you're right. It gives you the opportunity to present history a different way. It's one thing to have a documentary film, to have a book, to have an article, have museum exhibits. These are all different tools, but you've got to throw in that living history because that appeals especially young people. Education days are always my favorite days at a reenactment.
Yeah.
Usually the Friday before the big public event, bringing in those 80 school buses and watching those kids have a good time and get it. And will pay attention to the living historians. So it's a powerful tool, and I think the Oklahoma Historical Society has been a pioneering organization over the years to promote that.
Jake, let's dive into a little bit of the history we want to talk about today with the Seminole Nation. Of course, the Seminoles are one of the 5 tribes, what we used to call the 5 civilized tribes, and probably, if I'm not mistaken, the smallest of the 5 tribes, correct?
Correct.
And so let's get into that original history because, from my research that I was able to do, it started out with the Lower Creek Nation in around Georgia that kind of separated themselves a little bit and moved into Florida. And then we're talking in the early 1700s here. And then over time, they started to develop their own identity. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so diving back in oral history, that actually goes back even further. So, that term Muskogean, and not only does that talk about the Muskogee Creeks, but that also entails the Seminoles and Miccosukes and even the Choctaws and Chickasaws and Alabamas as well. Because a lot of our oral histories, they talked about how we were one people, and over time, different migrations or floods would kind of separate us, and all the different stories, and so that really falls under that. But geographically, our traditional homelands were in the southeastern part of the United States, so that's Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, and so a lot of our stories begin out there, being a matrilineal society. So what that means is our clans and our tribal towns are determined by our mother's bloodline and her mother's bloodline that goes all the way down. We still have that till this day, and so that's one way that we help preserve that's been handed down to us. That's it's our honor to carry that legacy on through our history, and then that's really how the Seminoles were actually able to survive that way, because we really believed in that, and also trying to hold on to that, especially after years of wars and removal. That's the only thing that we had. We didn't have no idea of currency or ownership. Everything that we had belonged in our hearts. So that's we have to pass that on. That's our, they always say that 7 generations ideology that we carry. You carry everything on for the next 7 generations. Everything you have to do has to benefit the next 7 generations.
One thing that's always intrigued me is that a lot of people don't know it, but the Muskogean people were part of the mound builders. And when people go to Spiro Mounds here in Oklahoma or Cahokia up in East St. Louis, they see these mounds and they think, oh, those ancient people who disappeared. They didn't disappear. they changed. They didn't, instead of having the big cities and the big mounds and the temples, started smaller villages spreading out, different resources. But the Muskogean speaking peoples really descend from those mound builders. Are there any art forms that you've seen that transcend from the mound builders and some of the artifacts we found at Spiral Mound that we have in our collections to current Seminole design?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of those designs, I always say they're evolutionary. And what I mean by that, I'm wearing a Seminole bandolier bag, but we can still see some of these designs that are moved over from our shell carvings or traditional tattooing. And it's just human nature being evolutionary, even, at our, what we call stomp dancing, back then they used to use deer toes and turtle shells, and people now use tomato cans. It's just evolutionary, right? And I've seen a lot of commonalities. Years ago, back in 2022, I was invited to the state capitol to present at Hispanic Heritage Day because they wanted me to talk about the story of Kawakaji who went to Mexico. And so I told that story, and then there was some people from Guatemala and Peru, and I'm wearing the same bandolier, and then they had the same designs on their skirts, and one woman had a paint on her face. So we started talking about that, and come to find out we have a lot of commonalities, even though we're from the southeastern part of the United States, and they're from South America and Central America. So it's really interesting to see that. And even I can see some stuff that we use. It's even in Greek pottery. It's in Hinduism and Buddhist. It's really interesting to see that, how everyone kind of thought the same way back then in early human history.
That's fascinating. The other thing I want to get into before we get too far down the road into the history is the origin of the word Seminole, which, as I was reading, it came from the Spanish word cimarron, and the Muskogee language had no R sound, so Cimarrones became Seminoles, and then later to Seminoles. Am I on the right track there?
Yes, that's one of the stories. I talked with my good friend Brian Zapata from the Seminole tribe of Florida, and one thing we've come to find out is if you ask 5 Seminoles a question, you're going to find different answers because we have, we see things differently, right? There's always a different side to the story. So that's one of I always don't discredit it. If it's historical like that, especially if it's oral history, I try my best not to discredit it unless it's more recent recorded history that we would know. I usually just try to go with it and then put my pieces together and then try to make it all fit. And so that's one of the advantages to that.
Well, I read it in a book, so it can't be right. It can't be wrong. Well, let's get a little bit more into this. And in 1783, the Treaty of Paris gives Florida to the Spanish, and then in 1819, Florida came to the United States, and that leads us into the Red Stick War, or also known as the Creek War of 1813 and 14, where you had Upper Creeks that resented American settlers flooding into the territory after the American Revolution, and they decided to fight back. Let's get into a little bit of this because I think that's going to lead us directly into how the Seminoles ultimately get to Oklahoma.
Yeah, so setting the stage for that, we really have to look at the climate for the United States. So, of course, the United States, they're highly in debt to a lot of these European countries for the American Revolution because they got to get their firearms somewhere, so they're buying it from Spain and France, and that kind of pushed into what we call the westward expansion, and everyone wants to settle in the Southeast. You guys have been down to Alabama. It's some of the best soil out there for sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, all kinds of crops out there. But the problem is you can't go and just take all these lands because there's Muskogees, Seminole, and Choctaws down in Alabama. And so we have rights to these lands. We don't have ownership, but we use this land for hunting, for different seasons. We have to migrate, depending if there's a flood, we have to move upland. And so that really kind of sets the stage for that. But we did a lot of fur trading down in the Southeast, places like Fort Toulouse. But what started the Seminole Wars, in actuality, I always try to say it did start with the Red Stick Wars. That's kind of the introduction to that. And so, but the first Seminole battle, the Battle of Foultown in 1817, which happened in Georgia, but when that happened, the Seminoles would jump the border into Florida. well, the United States can't go into Florida and start firing weapons because then that's an international crisis.
Right.
because Spanish territory.
Yes, correct. But and so the years goes on, and so Spanish relinquishes La Florida to the United States, and so that gives the United States the open aim to go after the Seminoles that are attacking these settlements and in southern Georgia, and so there was all these battles that are going on. That's what starts the first Seminole War in 1817.
And a general that would make his way into American history as a future president, Andrew Jackson, makes his appearance here. And he's leading a group of Lower Creeks and Cherokees to defeat the Upper Creeks at that particular point of time. And as you said, the Upper Creeks will flee into Florida, and that will bolster the ranks of the Seminoles.
Mm-hmm. And so getting into that with because I've spoken a lot with historians, and they try to say that the Seminoles got into Florida during the Seminole Wars. We've been going back and forth. We didn't have borders back then. We just went wherever the deer was, wherever the plants were growing at this time, and so we did have permanent settlements, and that's where that name creek comes from. Is a lot of our towns were built along riverbanks. And so we traveled all over the place in the Southeast through dugout canoes. We have stories of our people going up to the Great Lakes and trading with the Ojibwe or the Potawatomis up there, or they get in the canoes and they go into Cuba and Puerto Rico and Costa Rica and trading with them. And so when the Europeans saw that, they said, well, we're going to call these people creeks because their permanent settlements are located along these waterways.
Tell us a little bit about Osceola.
So Osceola was born in Alabama, not too far from actually present-day Fort Toulouse, out there in the world. There was a lot of towns that were out in that region, and actually my people are actually from that area as well, and not too far from Auburn. But Osceola, he was a Seminole. He was a warrior. He was never really seen as a Miko, a chief, because that was a different ranking. But he was seen as more of like a high-ranking warrior or general back then. But the way he carried himself, everyone followed that because no one wanted to leave Florida. No one can come into our lands and tell us, hey, you've got to pack your stuff up and go west of the Mississippi to these unknown lands, and we're going to bring our people in, and we're going to plant all these crops and then build farms on top of your ancestors' cemeteries, essentially. And so during the Seminole Wars, and one thing I will say here, since the Seminole Wars were so long, it's a 29-year-long struggle against the United States of encroachment on tribal lands. And so a lot of historians will say the first, second, third Seminole War, but to the Seminole people, we just call it the Seminole Wars, that 29-year-long struggle. And so that's essentially what really pushed that, and what really amplified it was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 with President Andrew Jackson, who signed that. And so, we've been fighting Andrew Jackson since 1812. Now we have stories of us fighting against him in New Orleans and in Tallahassee, at Burnt Corn Creek, all of his troops out there. So he already had what would I say, an animosity towards the Seminole and Muskogean people. And so that we kind of created the whole strong front. And so that brings up a lot of our great warriors. And I will say, what tough times brings a lot of tough people. And so Osceola is one of those guys that stepped up to the plate when it was time to, really defend our homelands and our traditional ideologies. And so, he was really seen as kind of a patriot at the time, not just to the Seminole people, but even across the United States. Everyone loved this guy because they see that this basically, the little guy is getting pushed around by the big guy, and he's standing up for himself. We all love that story, right? And so that's the story of Osceola going up against the United States, and even during the treaty signing of the Treaty of Fort Gibson, where he walks up to the table and reaches into his reaches for his knife and then plunges his knife right into the treaty and tells the agents there, this is how I'll sign. That's him saying, I'm not going to leave Florida. I'm going to stay here and fight till the last drop of Seminole blood is on this hunting ground. And so, he was one of those really great guys that we look up to. And I always tell folks, he was a great warrior, but really look into what he was fighting for. Don't idolize him as a person, but go after what he was thinking of, that true form of freedom.
When Enoch Kelly Haney was doing his painting of Osceola in that famous scene with the knife, he went back to Washington, D.C., and they pulled the treaty out, and there is a slit in it where the knife went in. That's a true story. And it's one of my favorite paintings by Enoch. And the defiance in his face, Kelly captured that perfectly. And was the kind of warrior that would have been charismatic, and people would have said, I'll follow you, which was kind of the Indian way. The natural leaders, people would just say, I'll go on a raid with you, or I'll go on a hunt with you because you're going to help me feed my family or protect my family, whichever it might be. And he was that kind of a leader.
Bob, where's that painting today? Do you know?
We have a print in our collection. We have one here because Kelly wanted to sell us one, and we raised the money and bought it. The original is probably in a private collection. I don't know where the original is, but there are prints.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that painting before. So
beauty.
I'm going to have to go do some searching.
Yeah. If you get a chance to come to Woka, we have a copy of it in our gallery.
Okay, fantastic.
When you say that word, Osceola, Apothleyahola was a person we'll talk about in a minute in the Civil War, who was another natural leader that people were willing to follow into the jaws of death almost. What is the Hola part? Is that the family name?
So the Ahola, which means it's like a singer who bringing out a call. And so in the English, they call him Osceola, but in the Skokie name is Osceola. So it's translated to the black drink singer. They're referring to the Yopon Holly drink. And so it's one of those ceremonial aspects that he picked up when he became a warrior. And so they a lot of those ceremonial leaders and Mikos referred to him as Osceola, what he did during the ceremony. So that's what he was known for the rest of his adult life.
Before we finish our conversation, I want to get back to the light horsemen of the Seminole Nation in the 1890s, going through those same ceremonial drinks as they would go out to enforce the law.
Okay. Yeah, stay tuned for a few minutes so we
can
get to that one. Okay. Well, in 1832, the Seminoles signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing, which relinquished all the claims to the Florida lands and held that the Seminoles would reunite on Creek lands in Indian Territory. And that sort of starts this migration. So there's an exploratory party of 7 Seminoles that come to Indian Territory in 1832. They start to scout everything out. They don't necessarily like what they see, do they, Jake?
No, they don't approve of Indian Territory, but actually at that time, the Indian agent signed off on their names. So when he went back to Washington, D.C., he said, hey, these Seminole chiefs want to move to Indian Territory. And actually, they did not sign at all. And he actually was fired for that in Washington for doing that act.
Okay, yeah. And so one of the things that they didn't like, which I thought this was funny, a little funny in my research, is they didn't like the cold climate here, which, if you've been in Oklahoma in July, you're like, cold climate. And they didn't like the proximity to the Plains Indians. And this is an issue that crops up time and time again, not only with the Seminoles, but with other of the eastern tribes that are forced to migrate to Oklahoma, is, the Plains Indians are getting squeezed and squeezed also, and they're having to come farther east to find, food and all of those kinds of things as well. So you start to see a lot more of the Plains Indians incursions into the eastern part of Indian Territory, 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And so they didn't really want anything to do with the Plains Indians.
Yeah, and even at that time during the Seminole Wars, there were a lot of paid American Indian scouts and mercenaries that were fighting against the Seminoles. And then we have records of the Shawnees and Delawares and even the Osage as well. And of course, why would we want to move next to the Osage? We're fighting the same exact people down in Florida over at the Battle of Loxahatchee or whatever, places like that. And so, they had this, this control of here, and even in Indian Territory, there was a lot of skirmishes between, the Osage and the Skokie Creeks that were in this area. I think in 1832, the Treaty of Holmes Creek was signed to say the Osage can't raid Fort Gibson or the surrounding areas because the Muskogee Creeks and Cherokees are there now.
Craig, we always talk about moving the 5 tribes to the west. And a lot of people assume that was unknown lands, but many of these people of 5 tribes have been coming through Oklahoma for years hunting buffalo. we have a lot of accounts. I know the Chickasaws were here a lot. They were very familiar with the territory. Even there were Cherokees who had been west, and a lot of people don't realize how mobile a lot of these Indian people were. It was nothing to get up and travel 200 miles for a purpose. But the buffalo was a real draw for all tribes, whether it's the tribes moving out of the northern Rocky Mountains and getting onto the plains, getting the horse, becoming, the greatest horseman in the world, kind of like the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. Here you have this mobile society, but the reason they're there are the buffalo. So the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the Seminoles, they like buffalo as well. They can make money on the pelts. You get the beef or the buffalo meat. And so a lot of these tribes were familiar with Oklahoma and what was out here. So they probably did not have a good impression at all just from previous generations and stories that would have been told around the campfire.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I will say for the viewers is there were buffalo in the Southeast and Florida and Alabama and Georgia. Actually, in the 1700s, Bernard Romans, who was from the British, actually was down in Northwest Florida in his journal. And he writes about Muskogean Seminole chiefs wearing bison horn headdresses. It's a lot different than what you would see, what the Pawnee would wear. Ours was just one horn split down the middle and worn at the temple facing forward. And there's a drawing that's done by Bernard Romans wearing that. So we have a lot of stories about the buffalo being down in the Southeast as well.
So as they were wiped out there, they would have started moving west where the buffalo were.
It was surprising to me when I watched Ken Burns' documentary on the American buffalo that they showed a map in there of how prolific they were all over the continent, even as all the way to the East Coast. And that was surprising to me. I always just assumed that they were in the Central Plains and in the West, but they were everywhere. With that, we'll take a quick break for a brief message.
Grab your cowboy hat and saddle up for a wild ride at the Pawnee Bill Ranch and Museum on Saturday, June 14th. It's time for the annual celebration of Pawnee Bill's Wild West Show. Explore the historic mansion and museum starting at 11 a.m., then step back in time with live blacksmithing, chuck wagon cooking, sharpshooters, and more from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. on the ranch grounds. Stick around for the pre-show at 7, then hang on to your hats. The Wild West Show kicks off at 7:30 with thrills, action, and history like you've never seen before. Visit okhistory.org/Pawnee Bill for tickets and the full schedule. Don't miss your chance to experience the legend live.
Okay, we're back, and I want to pick up where we left off because we were talking about the Treaty of Payne's Landing. And on March the 28th, 1833, the Seminoles that had come to Indian Territory in this exploratory party, they were essentially forced to sign a treaty which basically said that they liked the land that they saw. They were going to come here, and that treaty, as well as the Payne's Landing Treaty, was ratified by Congress in April of 1834. But the problem with that is that none of the Seminole leadership back in Florida agreed to that treaty, and this essentially kicks off what is known as the Second Seminole War.
Correct, and so that actually what a lot of historians will say the first battle of the Second Seminole War is the Battle of Dade's. They call it Dade's Massacre, but whenever a non-Indian is murdered, they call it a massacre. But historians we call it the Dade's Battle. And actually, that same day, Osceola actually assassinated Wiley Thompson at Fort King. So while Thompson, who had played a big part in that treaty, was actually assassinated by Osceola over at Fort King and then present-day Ocala. And then you go down to Bushnell, Florida, where the Dade's Battle happened, where Micanubby, who was leading the attack on Major Francis Dade, and that was the biggest battle. A lot of us referred to it as the Little Bighorn before Bighorn was a thing, because all the Seminoles wiped out all the troops in that battlefield.
In thinking about that, we can call it an assassination, but among the Seminole and Muskogee Creeks, in fact, all the 5 tribes before constitutional government, the basic law of the lawway of enforcing traditional ways was the law of blood revenge, is that individuals were empowered to enforce the law that was accepted by their people. And so when that so-called assassination was held, it was him saying, "No, I am the law," and he broke the law. He broke what the Seminoles will accept as a community. So he was outside of the law at that time, and he was just enforcing it. Same thing when it happened with the Ross faction when they came west and let's wipe out the ridges. They signed that treaty. A lot of people say those are assassinations, but it was the law of blood revenge, which was an ancient way of keeping some kind of social order within your community, whether it's tribe or a clan or a township. And so that's a little bit of background there. Now, later we'll get into the light horse and other law enforcement, but at the time, law of blood revenge was a way to keep things together.
Yeah, that was the thing that was done. Even Osceola assassinated a Seminole chief who signed on, or actually did sign off that treaty and actually got payment. And actually, in actuality, he actually shot this Seminole chief that he went by the name of Charlie Amothla. And when Osceola shot him, he took all the coins that he was given and threw them every direction. And that was kind of saying, this is worthless to us. I mean, all your money's gonna be out here, or we have to go move out west. And they even happened with William McIntosh as well, when he was assassinated by the Muskogee Creeks for giving up those lands in Alabama. So that's one real long, what we call like it's a eye for an eye type of justification.
Now, this was a very costly war. Second Seminole War goes from 1835 to approximately 1842. And one of the fascinating things that I read in preparation for this is it's the most costly Indian war ever fought by the United States Army. Over 1,500 soldiers died. It cost $20 million to fight this. Over 4,000 Seminoles were captured or surrendered. But this was a brutal war, and this was guerrilla warfare in swamps and forests. And I can't imagine the conditions of fighting down in Florida where that occurred. I mean, this was pretty rough stuff.
So one thing that we did in the Southeast with that guerrilla warfare tactics, because where we saw it as ineffective for troops to stand on a field and just line up and just wait to get shot. I always thought that was an accurate way to settle disputes. And so what the Seminoles did, they used a lot of the guerrilla warfare. They would, hide out in the tree lines. They would actually be up in the trees as sharpshooters. We had a lot of men that would just strike like lightning. One of the best way I would say to really visualize that is the last Mohicans, when Magua and all of his warriors on both sides and attacked the British. That's probably the best way to visualize that. But one thing that the Seminoles did during all these battles is our battles were already kind of pre-planned out. So what we had were a lot of our warriors would actually go out and track down these troops that are going down the Fort King Road and heading out to Fort Brooke. And they would watch every move they're taking. Then they go back to the chiefs and saying, this is where these guys are going. This is how many they have. And that's when then we all show up, and that's when we attack out of nowhere and then just disappear back out into the Florida wilderness. And so that's one way we fought. And another tactic that we used, what we call treeing. And what that means is we fought in pairs. So we would have someone with us, because if you have black powder rifles, you only got one shot, right? So we'd have one guy, in front of us who's shooting from a tree. When he fires, I move on to the next tree in front of him. I fire, he's already reloaded. So we're just going down the line. That's one tactic that was really popular in the Eastern Woodlands.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely fascinating. And along the way, as Seminole Indians are being captured, they're being transported back to Indian Territory. And so over time, the attrition starts, and ultimately, the capitulation at Fort Dade is signed on March the 6th of 1837. Jake, you'll have to make sure I get this name right. McCanopy? No, right?
Micanubby.
Micanubby. Okay, thank you. I need all the help I can get. When I give tours at the Capitol, Bob, of course, we have a lot of Native American art there, and there's a relatively new Choctaw painting by Dylan Cavan about the Choctaw Code Talkers, which we did a podcast about. And I always have to apologize for my bad Choctaw when I talk about that painting. So I appreciate all the help I can get, Jake.
No problem.
But that really sets the stage. That is basically the end of Seminole resistance. Although there is a a remnant of Seminoles that escaped so far into the swamps and into the forest that the United States government never gets to them.
Yes, and so that kind of sets for the Treaty of 1856. There was one Seminole chief by the name of Hobotameko, or his English name was Billy Bowlegs, and he was fighting out in Florida. And so a lot of the chiefs that were out here, one of the main components was John Jumper, Henry Mako, and he's trying to negotiate with the United States and the Muscogee Creeks and try to set aside lands, because Hobotameko says, well, if you guys don't have lands in Indian territory, why would I move here? I already have a home in Florida. And so as the years goes on, we get that treaty, but there were some Seminoles that stayed behind. One was Abiyaco, Sam Jones, and his people went into Florida, and there was about 250 to 300 of them were able to take refuge out in the Florida Everglades and stay out there. They're still out there to this day. That's where we have the Seminole tribe of Florida at.
Now, is that why I hear that the Seminoles in Florida claim to be the only Indian tribe never conquered by the U.S. Army?
Yeah, that's what they go by. And at the same time, a lot of us were brought here through the port of Tampa Bay at Egmont Key or Pensacola Bay, and going up through the Gulf of Mexico and going into New Orleans at Jackson Barracks and Fort Pike, and then going up the Mississippi River and branching off into Fort Smith, Arkansas, and then coming into the Three Forks Rivers and coming into Fort Gibson. But at the same time, this is the same time the Seminole Wars are going on during the removal. And so a lot of everyone was brought here as a prisoner of war. And so we have, it's not really shown in any portraits that I know of, or anything that's done in modern media. But not only were the warriors brought here in chains and shackles, but the women, the elders, and children were too. And I've actually gotten the chance to see a pretty big collection of shackles that were used for Seminoles were brought here. I was over at Loxahatchee Battlefield 3 years ago, and they showed us about 17 of them. And then they even showed us real small ones that would be used for a child that's probably about 5 years old. And that's the treatment that we got. And so a lot of us were brought here also on decommissioned slave ships as well, and also on kill boats coming into Indian territory.
That's fascinating. I did not know that. That is horrifying and fascinating at the same time. By 1842, General Zachary Taylor reports there's 2,833 Seminoles, including black people in Indian territory that had been either captured or removed voluntarily. And so now we are established in the Indian territory, but the Seminoles still don't really have a home of their own. They're still, I think at that point, expected to just live inside the Creek Reservation. And that's not good enough for the Seminoles. They want their own plot of land. And that leads us into the 1856 treaty with the Creeks.
Correct. And so at the time of the signing of 1856 treaty, it's exactly right. The United States wanted us to be under the jurisdiction of the Muscogee Creek Nation. Well, that's not good enough for the Seminoles. And there was some factions of the Muscogee Creeks that were fighting against the Seminoles in the wars. I believe in 1837, there was about 700 enlisted warriors that went into Florida to fight against the Seminoles. And so, but the Seminoles, we were told if we were going to go to Indian territory, we would have our own lands, and that wasn't promised to us. And so as the years goes on, and those negotiations between the United States and the Seminoles, there's a really great delegation photo that's taken in 1852 that has Billy Bowlegs and John Jumper and a few other band chiefs that are in Washington, D.C. and those negotiations. And so it took some time, but finally on August 7th, 1856, the Treaty of the Creeks was ratified. And so that recognized the Seminole Nation as a separate sovereign Indian nation here in Indian territory.
And that gave the Seminole Nation over 2.1 million acres as a part of their own reservation. And so that's a pretty large swath of land for a fairly small tribe.
Yes, and in our lands, per the treaty, were everything in between the two Canadian rivers. So that's kind of starting out in Pottawatomie County, where Asher is, Oklahoma County, where we're sitting at right now, in Canadian County, all the way out to the Texas border was lands that were set aside for the Seminoles. Unfortunately, as time goes on, the Treaty of 1866 kind of relinquishes that, and that's a result of the Civil War.
So
Excuse me, Trey.
go
One
ahead.
reason for that kind of that linear that was access to the buffalo out on the Southern Plains. The American leaders would have said, well, if they're going to take care of themselves, they need to be able to hunt and feed themselves. And access, just like the Cherokee Outlet, was there to allow the Cherokees to go out and hunt the buffalo. The Seminoles, Muskogee Creeks had this corridor going all the way out onto the high plains where they could hunt the buffalo.
Yeah, and so as part of the agreement, the United States government agreed to cover the losses in moving to the new reservation, and they also agreed to help support schools, to help provide funding for agriculture. They agreed to build a council house for the Seminoles, and so life starts to assume some bit of normality. I think you start, from the mid 1830s into the 1850s, but this one thing comes, and it's a terrible thing for the Indian nations in Oklahoma, and it's the Civil War.
And just step back real quickly. Before the Treaty of 1856 was brought about, there was another Seminole chief by the name of Kawakaji, and he actually went to Mexico because he did not like the conditions here in Indian Territory, and him and a group of Seminoles and escaped slaves actually went into Brackettville, Texas, and then going into the mountains of Mexico and creating a settlement out there. And they stayed for about 10 years. He actually served as a colonel in the Mexican army for about 60 years while he was out there. But that was kind of a result of, the attitude of the Seminoles were saying, why are we going to live here? We have to be under someone else's rule. And so that's why a lot of them packed up and went to Mexico.
And the Kickapoos and even the Cherokees, Sequoyah died while he was searching for a new home for the Cherokees in Texas. And it's a lot of those tribes saw that as another opportunity.
The unfortunate thing about the Civil War is most of the tribes found themselves caught because the Union Army removed their soldiers from Indian Territory. There goes that protection. Most of the Indian agents were Confederate, and the Indian agents were trying to talk the tribes into coming on board with the Confederate states, which all of the 5 tribes officially did. Although, as we know, we've talked about in previous podcast episodes, it was certainly not a majority decision of most of the citizens of those tribes, because in any given case, probably half or more of the tribes, not only did they not really want to align with the Confederacy, they really just wanted to stay neutral and not really get involved. But of course, the Civil War drew everybody into that, and it was John Jumper who signed the agreement with the Confederate nation to come on board on behalf of the Confederate states.
Yeah,
Hey.
and oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, well, in all the tribes, that was almost a new green light to be able to seek vengeance on your former enemies within the tribe. And so that old fight that you were talking about with the Upper Creeks, Lower Creeks, fighting, 50 years earlier, it's another reason to go at it again.
Yeah, and then with the Civil War, it really devastated not only just Indian Territory, but even the American Indian tribes. I believe there was statistically about 40% of the children after the Civil War were left as orphans because so many Seminoles were just brought into this war. And, we were at the Battle of Honey Springs, at Round Mountain. That was a group that went with Hobe up to Fort Scott, Kansas, that were trying to evade this whole conflict. And in that pursuit, they were brought right into that battle or the Civil War. And so it was really, just devastating to the Seminoles. It wasn't really our conflict. We didn't see ourselves as Americans at the time. We weren't even American citizens, but they brought us, into this battle, and so we had to pick and choose. And so, it's families fighting against each other once again, and it's, conflict's never great at all. I always tell people, even with battle reenactments, I always, say it's, war should always be the last resort in any instance. It's for us, we're mainly a peaceful people. We try to do everything diplomatically. One of the best ways that we've seen diplomacy being done in the 1800s was a portrait that was done in 1843 by John Mack Stanley of all the Indian nations that were meeting up in Tahlequah in the International Treaty Council of 1843. That's how we used to settle stuff. But with this new kind of lifestyle, they're telling us that we have to go to war with one another. That was, pretty odd for us because we used to settle our disputes with stickball back then. We didn't believe in shedding or spilling blood of our brethren. So it was a weird new climate to us.
And part of that too, one thing that's always fascinated me, that American Indians really did not have the same concept of personal property that Western Europeans and Americans had at the time. Whereas Americans said, oh, we need laws to protect personal property and to protect my money, protect my land, and all that. That's where laws began. And a lot of the mixed blood Indian leaders who wanted constitutional government wanted it to protect their property because they were accumulating. But their traditionalists would not have said that. They would have said, no, it belongs to all of us. And so how can we fight each other because it doesn't belong to us? It belongs to all of us together. And if we can find a peaceful way to live together, it'll be harmonious. And looking for that harmony, it was so different than the Western European tradition of land ownership and personal property and laws to protect it and armies to protect your property and your land. That was not the Indian way.
And so with the Civil War finally coming to an end, and Indian territories just left in shambles, and so we're in the Reconstruction era, and so that brings about the Treaty of 1856 or 1866, and essentially what that meant was the Seminoles were being punished for fighting in the Civil War with the Confederacy, and so we were told we had to sell all that 2 million acres, and we had to sell it for 15 cents an acre. Back to the United States, and the lands that we want, we have to buy it from the Muskogee Creeks at 50 cents an acre, and so that's we're getting the shorthand of the stick all throughout the 19th century.
Well, ultimately, you go from over 2.1 million acres of territory to a little over 365,000 acres of territory, which is essentially what Seminole County is today. Correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, the United States government definitely exacted their pound of flesh out of the tribes that aligned with the Confederacy in that era. And so that really sets the scene for, the 1860s and 1870s. And of course, we get to the end of the 19th century and we get into allotment now and the preparation for statehood.
So a little bit before statehood, the Seminole Nation is rebuilding, so we really amplify on our tribal white horse, tribal sovereignty, even going against the Allotment Act, going against the Dawes Commission in 1890, and then education was a big thing also. The Seminole Nation built 2 schools that were fully operated by the Seminole Nation, fully funded by the Seminole Nation. So we built one school in 1891, which was Miccosukee Academy. And then in 1894, we built the Girls Academy, which was Amahaga, and those were fully funded by the Seminole Nation up until 1906, where the federal government came in and seized our schools, and they kind of labeled us as quote unquote incompetent, and so they took the schools from us and it became government schools. But those were the ideas of Seminoles back then, where we're even though we're constantly have these struggles, we still have to keep moving no matter what. And so that's one of the things that we really look onto around the turn of the century before statehood.
And one thing too, Trait, that I always like to remind people when I'm doing an exhibit or a book is that the Seminoles had a constitution by this time. And so they had, a judicial system, an executive branch, a legislative branch, and the light horsemen that I referred to earlier were still very active in the 1890s. So at a time after the land run of 89, Oklahoma City is growing. Muskogee is the biggest city in the Twin Territories with railroads and movie theaters and opera houses. Here are the Seminole, who have their own constitutional government, their own source of income, and they would designate these light horsemen. And the light horsemen were given the authority of the government, the way the old law of blood revenge would have been working because a leader could do it. Here you have the state or the nation saying, and those light horsemen were some of the most effective law enforcement officers in the 1890s at a time when the Doolins and the Daltons and, all the famous outlaws are running around. You didn't mess with the Seminole light horsemen. And they would go through, and there's a great anthropologist got to interview a lot of these Seminole light horsemen. And so I did an article for the Indian Law Review on constitutional government and law enforcement. And those Seminole light horsemen were around long enough where researchers got to interview them and witness drinking the black tea is what they called it at the time. I'm not sure what really that is, but going through this ceremony, and it would kind of bring them all together and in a sense of protection. And some mind control, perhaps. There could have been other things involved there, but they would want to go through these ceremonies that would protect them as they were going out after the bad guys. And so that was surviving until 1898 and the Curtis Act, when they said, yep, no more tribal government, no more law enforcement, no more schools. And then that was the road to allotment that would eventually happen by 1907.
We have one more. We're starting to get toward the end of our time, and I want to be sure and get this in too, because there's one more big thing that happens to the Seminole Nation, and it is the Greater Seminole Oilfield in the 1920s. And that is a massive oil field that's discovered essentially in 1923 with the Betsy Foster #1 well that's drilled near Wewoka. Came in at 2,800 barrels a day. That establishes the Wewoka field. Ultimately, 39 separate oil pools are developed within a region that, with really Seminole County as the center of that region. And overnight, all of Seminole County becomes Boomtown. And with it comes all the good things about Boomtown and all the bad things about Boomtown as well.
Yeah, we actually have a photograph at the Seminole Nation Museum of where Miccosukee Academy sits, and then it was an aerial shot, and it shows all of Seminole County. I just see all these oil derricks all over the place, and it's insane to see that. But unfortunately, the Seminoles actually didn't get any of the profit from that oil money because of the Allotment Act, and so only about 20% of Seminole County actually belonged to the Seminoles, to the Seminole Nation. So we actually didn't see a single penny of that, and we still have it. And so, but when we get into the kind of more modern day of the McGirt versus Oklahoma, which they're trying to look into now. That's the climate of that. We're trying to rectify the error of humanity, was because this is ours. This is what the treaty says. This is what the federal government said they would take care of us. And so, why would y'all move here and then take all of our oil money and leave Seminole County just dry? This is Seminole County and Tulsa were one of the richest places in all of America.
Yeah. Peak production, July 30th of 1927, 527,000 barrels were pumped. And in 1927 through 1929, over 150 million to 200 barrels of oil in that time. It was a massive oil field. At one time, it accounted for 2.6% of the world's entire oil supply during that era. Is it still prolific for oil and gas out there?
I've lived in Seminole for 26 out of my 27 years, and it's pretty. I would say the main climate out there is definitely oil
strippers and reclamation. They'll go in with some secondary recovery, but I remember my dad lived in he helped start Seminole Junior College in the 1960s, and he had a chance to buy some stripper wells. At that time, oil was $10 a barrel. And he could have bought these for almost nothing. People were trying to sell them to anybody who would take them because it cost more to service a well at $10 a barrel than it did in income. So he missed an opportunity, or I might have not ever been in his story. I might have been a rich kid of an oil man. But the oil patch is still going there, and some production, but it's mainly what they call stripper wells.
Bob, I don't know. I can't really picture you as an oil tycoon. Yeah. So I don't know. You have too many scruples for that. Well, and I want to mention too, before we close up, but during this time of oil discovery and exploration in Seminole County, we have the first female chief of the Seminole Nation, and that's Alice Brown Davis. She served from 1922 until her death in 1935. What do you want to say about her?
So one thing that's really cool about Alice Brown Davis is she's kind of our 20th century resistance to the United States. And at that time, before 1969, a lot of our principal chiefs were appointed by the President of the United States. Well, at that time, the United States wanted to buy a lot of these lands because of the oil rush. And so one of the places that was sought after was Amahaga School. And so they bring in different chiefs like George Harrison and Hobart Amico, and then they bring Alice Brown Davis, and they're saying, no, we're not going to sell these lands to you guys. You've already taken plenty enough. And so Alice Brown Davis stayed as a no person that during that whole time of her her reign as principal chief of the nation. And so we really look up to her as when that final resistance to the bigger portion of the government. But later in 1969 on March 8th, the Seminole Nation finally ratifies their own constitution, so we can actually operate without any type of interference from the United States presidents. And so that gives us the opportunity to elect our principal chief, our assistant chief, and our tribal council, and we still go by that to this day.
Two things, Trey, I'd like to add to that is a descendant of Alice Brand Davis is Jesse Ed Davis, the famous guitarist. We've already done an entire podcast on Jesse Ed, but he's related to her. And I admire her. When I was editor of the Chronicles in the 1980s, I published an article by someone who did a biography of her. And I admire her a lot. I use her as one of the women in Oklahoma history we need to emulate. But getting tribal sovereignty back has been so important, not just for the Seminole people, but to me it's good for the state. We have some political leaders who don't want to deal with the tribes as equals, but they are equals in terms of federal law. So if you look at the law of the land, tribes have their own sovereign governments, and they're supposed to be treated as equals in this give and take between states and cities and counties and tribes and the federal government. But yet some people say, no, we want to disregard that. We've got to respect tribal sovereignty. People need to understand the importance of that and how it's not just a way to make up for past offenses and bad treatment, but it should have always been there. And the tribes never gave up all of their sovereignty anyway. They may have lost the ability to have their own education system or their own law enforcement, but they kept that sovereignty in terms of being people who had a community, a sense of community. And what we've done now with the law since the 1960s and 70s, starting with JFK and Lyndon Baines Johnson, even Richard Nixon, and then finally in the 1970s and 80s, we start getting the ability to resurrect tribal government, treating all of the community with housing, with nutrition, with law enforcement. And that's what we're dealing with now. And because it's evolving, as the Seminoles have always evolved, Seminoles are coming up with their own version of industry, business, government, the way it shapes. And every tribe is different. And it should reflect the way the Seminole want their government to be. And I know we've been through some troubles with tribal leadership, but I think that we're going to emerge from that. And I think the Seminole people will find this way in the future. But we've got to respect that it's your right to decide who your leader is going to be and how your government looks, not the way that we want it to be, just because we're in a state government or the federal government. So I think that respect has to be first respect, and then the actual ability to help your own people will be there.
Absolutely. I always tell folks the treaties are the supreme law of the land, no matter where you are in the United States. All those treaties that pertain to where you are regarding the Indian nations that are here, that's the supreme law of the land. So I appreciate you for saying that, Dr. Blackburn.
Well, I want to say, Jake, it's been so great to have you on this podcast, sharing your knowledge with everyone out there, which, as you all have heard, is extensive, but also everything that you're doing to keep the traditions of your people alive and to keep those stories alive, and all of the ways that you share that, not only in your official role at the Seminole Nation, but in all of the things that you do as a volunteer to get out there and share those stories. So we appreciate you so much.
Absolutely. Like I said last week, Trey, as long as I'm here, I'll support our historic sites and OHS and support education. That's why I'm here.
Well, very good. Well, Bob, it's been another great episode. I just always enjoy these conversations, and I can't wait to hear what we're going to talk about next.
Well, same here, and thank you for joining us. I always learn when I deal with my Indian friends and learning more about your culture, so thank you for sharing.
All right, Mado.
With that, we will see you next time. You have been listening to a Very Okay podcast hosted by Trey Thompson and Dr. Bob Blackburn. The podcast is produced by the Oklahoma Historical Society. Visit us at okhistory.org and find us on social media by searching for @OKHistory. I encourage you to purchase a membership to OHS to help us continue our mission to collect, preserve, and share Oklahoma's unique and fascinating history.